Hello and welcome back to Cognitive Psychology. We're going to be covering Chapter 9 in this session. We're going to be starting our discussion of language, so it's going to be our first pass at language. Chapter 10 will also cover language. In this chapter, we're going to cover basic issues and speech processing. So reading and some more complicated issues will be covered in Chapter 10. All right, let's get started. All right, so first off, let's just talk about studying language and which fields really study language. So there's the field of linguistics, which is an anthropology subdivision, and it studies the elements of language. It's a very scientific, very much looking at the elements that make up a language. So the sounds, the grammar, things like that. In psycholinguistics, now we're moving over into a field that is a psychology field, borrowing a lot of the techniques from anthropology. But in this field, we're going to be studying the psychological processes that are involved in producing and comprehending language. Psycholinguistics would cover spoken language, signed languages, written languages, basically any kind of ability to communicate meaning in a rule-based, coherent way. So we obviously are going to be covering psycholinguistics, given that I'm a psychologist and not an anthropologist. So now, fair warning for my students, my minor in my PhD training was psycholinguistics. So I have a tendency to really enjoy this chapter. It's one of the only times in my academic year that I really get to talk about psycholinguistics. So I kind of throw everything into it. So hopefully you also enjoy the study of language. So first off, let's just start with some universals that are true of every type of natural language that exists in the world. First off, these would be characteristics that help define what a language is, not what English is, but what it means to be a language as opposed to something else. So when we talk about these characteristics, all of these characteristics must be present in order for us to say this is a natural language. These characteristics show that language is the jewel in the crown of cognition, as Steven Pinker says. Of course, as a psycholinguist, he thinks, language is the greatest. So, but it really is. I think I flippantly made a comment earlier about how when they wanted to model how humans think, the first thing they tried to teach a computer was language. And I jokingly said, why don't you take the most complex behavior that could ever exist and try and teach that to a computer? Language is really complex. Anyone who has learned a second language knows that you can learn the vocabulary, but then you still may not understand what the speakers are saying because they use idioms and other kinds of phrases that really don't mean what the words imply they mean. And yet every native speaker of the language knows them. It's just about the most complicated thing you can think of. So we're going to be talking about a very complex topic here. So let's get into those universals. The first one is what's called semanticity. That means that language sounds carry meaning. Now that might sound like duh, because obviously how could it be a language if it didn't carry meaning? But that's the point, right? That these universals are all the characteristics that must be present in order for something to be a language. Semanticity refers to certain sounds that we make in our language that are set aside as meaningful. There are other sounds that we could make with our mouths or with our hands or other things that don't mean anything in the language. So just to give you some examples, all the things I'm saying right now, those sounds, they're meaningful. Things that are sounds that we make with our mouth but are not necessarily part of the language would be things like, just the other day I was trying to teach my 3-year-old granddaughter how to make the sound of a purring kitten, right? Not everybody can do that with their tongue, except for everybody in Spanish-speaking cultures can, because it's actually a phoneme in Spanish. It's not a phoneme in English. So for an English speaker, would be a noise. You can do it like a purring kitten, or you can make it like a motorboat. You can do different things with it, but it's the same basic sound. But in English, it doesn't mean anything. In Spanish, it does mean something. If you say it it's not a long drawn out one in Spanish, but anyway. Within each language, there are certain sounds that are designated as what we call phonemes, and we'll talk about that later. And those are sounds that carry meaning. And there are other sounds that are basically sound effects and that we don't necessarily use for part of the language. And that's really an important distinction, right, to determine what's a language and what's not. Arbitrariness. There is no inherent connection between the symbols of the language and their meanings. I keep saying natural languages because in natural languages, those that have emerged organically within the ethnic group or the culture, there really is no inherent connection between the symbols and then their meanings. Knowing the language is what enables you to understand the connection between the sounds and what they're referring to. It's easier to do it with concrete words. So I'll give you an example of like the word microorganism is quite a long word and it's describing a teeny tiny little thing, right? Like there's no size-based relationship between those two things. We all know that micro means small, but there's nothing about those 5 letters that make it clear that those 5 letters mean small. It's just the meaning that lets us know that that means small. It's arbitrary that organization of letters and sounds means small, right? That's just arbitrary. Here we have a small word that means something big, right? The word whale refers to a very large animal, but it's a small word, even as it's spelled, let alone how you pronounce it. Whale. Whale? I feel like I'm saying it like it has 2 syllables. Whale. Whale. Very small word to describe something very large. There's really no direct relationship between the symbols that we're using and then the objects that are being described or the behavior that's being described. Now I say in natural languages that's true. Anybody who knows ASL knows, or another language's version of ASL, knows that there are connections between the gestures and the thing that they're referring to sometimes. It's not completely arbitrary, and that's because the language was created. And so the hand gesture where you're sort of like pushing something over your shoulder means that it happened yesterday or in the past. Like the symbol for dog very clearly relates to the concept of dog. You can either, there's 2 ways to make the symbol dog. One is basically to make a panting dog face. Like that's one way to do it. The other one is to tap your thigh and snap your fingers like you're calling a dog. That's the kind of association between the symbol, the thing that represents dog, and the actual thing that it refers to that you wouldn't expect to see in a natural language. In natural languages, there are no associations between those things. It's arbitrary. Flexibility. The connection between the symbol and the meaning is changeable. So for example, this object, when it was first invented, didn't actually look like this very much, but they called it an automobile. I don't know at what point it shifted from automobile to car, but those 2 different words are basically referring to the same object. And also each word kind of refers to specific subsets of that object. It's all very flexible. And we all know that if a person says automobile or a person says car, that they're talking about something that you can drive, that consumes fuel of some sort, and those kinds of things. Like we all know what it means because language is flexible. What do you call this? Okay, I'm sorry, the only off-brand that I could find had a white box, so it's all very difficult to kind of see. But so we have, facial tissue, right? So would you call this facial tissue, or would you, even though it's an off-brand, call it Kleenex? I know for me, I would call it Kleenex. I don't call it Puffs, even if the box says Puffs. Puffs is the #2 selling facial tissue, and yet it would never occur to me to call that Puffs, right? I call it Kleenex. I sometimes will shorthand it to tissue. Although I did that yesterday, I said to my husband, do we need to get more tissue? And I literally meant Kleenex. And he goes, what kind of tissue? And I had to say facial tissue. and we buy Kleenex. So that was kind of the dumbest conversation, but it reminded me of when he was in the military. Military issued products had the funniest way of naming themselves. It would say tissue, comma, facial on the box, or it would say lipstick, comma, chap on your chapstick. So maybe I kind of reverted back to a little like military jargon, and I said tissue, comma, facial. But anyway, I would typically call it Kleenex, right? So how did Kleenex get in there first and get so powerful? Probably because they were first, right? Or they had the best advertising or whatever. Probably most of us don't call it facial tissue. Naming refers to the idea that all objects have names. And I just pulled out some like more recent objects that have occurred, in the last 20 years that have had to be named, right? So we've got, Google. It's gotten so powerful that it's now become a verb. It's not just a name, it's a verb, right? So we're Googling something. You could be Googling something while using a search engine called Bing. You would never say I'm Binging something, but you would say I'm Googling something. The dating apps example, we had to invent a name for this, right? Back in the original version of dating things, that you could put your name on and hope somebody would pick you or whatever, that was called Match.com, right? Like that was the first one. And it was a web-based product and things, but now they've really proliferated and we had to come up with a name for it. So we call it dating apps, right? And it means the whole group of things that you could be using. I got a picture of a drone, right? My son calls it a quadcopter, and then he shorthands it to quad. Well, he also shorthands ATVs to quads. I'm like, can we please? I'm old. I call ATVs ATCs. I'm so old. So come on, man. Can we please come up with different names for these newer objects? But we have to do that. Everything in our world as humans, everything needs a name, or else we're a little perplexed. Why? Like, what are we supposed to call that? Everything needs a name. And that's because one of the great things about language is it enables you to talk about things that are not currently here. So if I wanted my son, as I did over the summer, to go get his drone and go get video of the osprey that are nesting across the street, I could say to him, get your drone and go videotape the osprey. Now, none of that was here, right? The drone was not in the room. The osprey are not in the room. But thanks to language and his knowledge that there's a platform across the street with osprey on it, and his knowledge that he owns a drone and that it can video, we can talk about things that aren't here right now, right? Or ideas or things from the past or things that are going to happen in the future, which refers to the next issue, displacement, right? We can refer to the past. We can refer to the future. We can talk about things that aren't here. That's one of the things that makes human language different from even animal versions of communication, is that we can talk about things that have never happened. We can talk about things that one of us has seen and the other one hasn't. Now, I will give bees credit because they can do a bee dance and tell their hive mates where they found nectar. So they have got an ability to communicate about something that's not here right now and give information to their peers. But I mean, that's the one thing they can talk about, is the location of nectar. They can't talk about anything else, which, we can talk about a lot of things. The other person doesn't have to have experienced it. They don't have to necessarily know anything about what you're talking about. And thanks to language, you can bring them up to speed and make sure that they know what you're referring to. So displacement is a really important aspect about language and what really makes it special. Productivity. We also call this generativity. This is the idea that almost everything you say is brand new. You've never said it before. No one's ever said it before. Almost every phrase, unless you're reciting a speech or your lines for a play, everything you utter is brand new and has never been uttered before. And that's pretty impressive, that on the fly, we can string words together in such a way that other people can understand what we're trying to say. Like, that's pretty amazing. We've gotten so good at that now we can see mistyped texts or messenger messages or however you DM people. I can say DM and you know what I mean, right? We've got a new name that didn't used to be what we called it. When we would use an electronic device to communicate with each other, we called it, a text or an email. Now we all know what a DM is, right? We have new names for new objects and activities, and in in a text or a message, we can have misspellings, we can have all sorts of messed up stuff in there, and we can still communicate our ideas to a receiver. There are times when you have to ask the typist, what are you trying to say? That happens. But it's amazing how even with a completely novel phrase that you've never seen before, you can figure out that they didn't really mean to spell that word that way. They meant to say an actual word, right? Like, it's amazing what we can do on the fly. So you can see that I'm quite passionate about language. And so let's stop here for a break. We'll come back in the next segment. We'll talk about the pragmatics of language.